The echoes of Elmwood Cabin. In the heart of an ancient forest, where towering pines stretch toward the sky and the ground is cloaked in a thick layer of snow, lies Elmwood Cabin. Isolated and forgotten, the cabin stands in a small clearing, surrounded by the dense, silent woods. The air is crisp, filled with the sharp scent of pine and the biting chill of winter, as snowflakes drift lazily from the overcast sky. Alex, a young writer searching for inspiration, had always been drawn to solitude. As a writer, the bustle of city life often left him feeling overwhelmed, his creative spark dimmed by the noise and distractions. So when he heard about Elmwood Cabin, tucked away deep in the heart of a snow-covered forest, it seemed like the perfect place to escape, to find the peace he needed to finish his novel. The drive up to Elmwood was treacherous. Snow had begun to fall heavily as Alex navigated the winding roads, the tires of his car struggling to grip the icy surface. The dense forest surrounding him seemed to grow darker with every mile, the towering pine trees casting long, eerie shadows on the snow. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw at Elmwood Cabin, standing alone in a small clearing, its wooden exterior partially hidden by a thick blanket of snow. The cabin was old, much older than Alex had expected. The wooden walls were weathered and creaked with the slightest breeze, and the windows were fogged up, as if the warmth inside was struggling to keep out the cold. But Alex didn't mind. In fact, the rustic charm of the place was exactly what he had been looking for. After unpacking his things, Alex settled in for the night, lighting a fire in the stone hearth and sitting down at the small wooden table with his notebook. He had come here to write, but as he stared at the blank page before him, no words came. Instead, an unsettling silence filled the cabin, broken only by the howling wind outside and the occasional groan of the old wooden beams. As the night wore on, the storm outside intensified. Snow pelted the windows, and the wind howled like a wild beast. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, struggling to keep the cabin warm. Alex tried to focus on his writing, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin itself, to the unsettling feeling that he wasn't entirely alone. Around midnight, just as Alex was about to give up and go to bed, he heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was distant, like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. It was a voice echoing through the walls of the cabin. "Help me!" Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to listen, but the voice had faded, replaced by the roar of the storm. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination, the product of a tired mind and the eerie atmosphere of the old cabin. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had heard it, clear as day. Determined to shake off the unease, Alex went to bed, pulling the heavy woolen blankets up to his chin. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the evening over and over. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it again, louder this time and closer. "Help me!" Alex sat up in bed, his breath visible in the cold air. The voice was unmistakable now, a desperate plea that sent chills down his spine. It seemed to be coming from outside, somewhere in the forest. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay inside, to ignore the voice and wait for morning. But something compelled him to investigate, a sense of duty he couldn't quite explain. Grabbing a flashlight and his heavy coat, Alex stepped outside into the freezing night. The storm had calmed slightly, but snow still fell in thick, silent flakes, covering the ground in a pristine white layer. He scanned the forest with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Help me!" The voice was louder now, more urgent. It was coming from deep within the forest, where the trees were thickest and the snow was untouched. Alex trudged through the snow, following the sound, his breath coming in short, nervous gasps. The cold bit into his skin, and his hands were numb, but he pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite understand. After what felt like an eternity, he came to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned well, half buried in snow and overgrown with ivy. The voice was coming from the well, echoing up from the depths.
"Help me!"
Alex approached the well cautiously, peering over the edge. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the beam of his flashlight. But then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw something, a faint ghostly figure at the bottom of the well. It was an old man, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear.
"Please, help me!"
Without thinking, Alex grabbed the rope tied to the side of the well and began to lower himself down. The cold air rushed past him as he descended, the walls of the well closing in around him. When he reached the bottom, he saw the man more clearly. He was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, and his skin was as cold as the snow outside.
"I've been trapped here for so long,"
he whispered, his voice trembling.
"Please, help me get out."
Alex reached out to him, but as soon as his hand touched the man's, he felt a surge of cold, so intense it burned. The man's eyes turned black, and his face twisted into a sinister smile. Before Alex could react, the man lunged at him, his icy grip tightening around his throat. Panic set in as Alex struggled to free himself, but the man's strength was inhuman. His cold fingers dug into Alex's skin, and his vision began to blur. He was going to die here, in this cursed well, at the hands of a spirit long forgotten by time. But then, a memory flashed through his mind, a memory of his grandfather, who had always told him stories of the old ways, of how to protect oneself from the spirits of the forest. With the last of his strength, Alex reached into his pocket and pulled out the small iron knife his grandfather had given him years ago. He plunged the knife into the man's chest, and with a scream, the spirit dissolved into a cloud of mist, disappearing into the darkness of the well. Alex collapsed, gasping for air, the cold seeping into his bones. He had faced death, but somehow he had survived. With great effort, Alex climbed out of the well, his body aching and his mind reeling. The forest was silent now, the snow falling gently around him. He stumbled back to Elmwood Cabin, his legs barely able to carry him. As he entered the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeted him, and he collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but alive. The echoes of the night's events lingered in his mind, but he knew he had overcome something far more than just a spirit. He had faced his deepest fears and emerged stronger, more resilient. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the forest was calm, the snow glistening in the sunlight. Alex sat by the fire, his notebook open before him. This time, the words came easily, flowing from his pen like water. He wrote about the cabin, the forest, and the spirit that had haunted him, turning his ordeal into a story of survival and triumph. Elmwood Cabin had tested him, but in the end, it had given him what he had come for: inspiration, not just for his writing, but for his life. He had faced the darkness and found the strength to overcome it. And as he wrote, the echoes of that night faded away, leaving him with a sense of peace he had never known before.